special guest with us. We have Chris Pravat, who's our beef and forage economist. He's our state specialized agent. And I'm Caitlin Bainham, the Marion County Livestock Extension Agent. And I took the topic today to go over some current events in beef economics with Chris. He's really more of the expert in this field. And as I've been perusing different social media outlets, news outlets, there's a lot of opinions and kind of different facts kind of around. So I'd like to clear the air a little bit and kind of have an open discussion with Chris about a few topics that we've outlined. So Chris, the first thing I kind of want to lay on the table is basically what are some of the effects that this COVID-19 global pandemic has had on our beef industry? If you could just kind of point out some of the main issues that we're starting to see there, and then we'll go into some of the other issues.
Absolutely. A couple of things that have really impacted us from COVID-19. The first being, the world demand for U.S. beef. We started seeing impacts in terms of reductions of exports to certain specific countries, Japan, South Korea, during those certain time periods where they were having COVID-19 outbreaks. So, that changed things for us, as well as the restaurant industries and tourism industries in Asia. So that was one of the impacts where we weren't selling as many products, as well as products at the same levels in terms of price. So that was the first impact that we really started seeing back in January and February from COVID-19. Before we even had a run on things here in the United States, we started seeing changes in terms of our export markets. Now we're still exporting a significant amount of beef to these countries, but it's obviously COVID-19's changed the way we do that business. The second really impact from COVID-19 with that, with those changes in terms of exports, the second thing we saw was we started seeing small reductions in terms of cattle prices. So the calves we sell here in Florida, as well as in the Southeast, we started seeing declines in terms of their value because there was this potential outlier event that was out there. From our first date that we start seeing damages from COVID-19 is January the 10th. And again, that is due specifically to export markets. All the way to today, there's potentially $200 to $300 worth of damages, just depending on when we may have marketed some animals. And as we move forward, there may be even more damages. So it's just continuing to allow this event to play out and really focus on maximizing our revenues if we can. Another impact that obviously has been seen for consumers has been on increases in beef prices at retailers, at grocery stores. So that's really been a concern for some retailers that have less discretionary income, for the 30 plus million Americans that have lost their jobs. Higher meat prices is likely going to cause some damages to those families' finances. Where are we right now in terms of, we talk about the bottleneck that's occurring from COVID-19 at meat processing facilities. You have some that are closed, some that are, they're not fully staffed. They may be staffed at 50%, but overall, you've got the meat packing facilities that are probably between 70 to 80% of normal capacity in terms of how they can operate under social distancing guidelines. So I just think, hey, that's just something we have to focus on and really understand as we move forward, that we're not able to slaughter or harvest as many animals as we originally had planned, and that's kind of causing a little bit of a bottleneck in terms of fat cattle that are in the feedlots and are ready to be harvested.
And so those are an important point to note when people might hear the term shortages. versus, you know, what we're really seeing in this bottleneck. Maybe you can talk to the fact that it's not actually a shortage.
Yes, absolutely. So, in terms of where we are right now, you know, there is a significant reduction in supply of meat proteins, whether that's beef, pork, or poultry, from 30 days ago. So we have a reduction in supply. We have less than what we thought we would. The reason it's not called a shortage is because in economics, supply and demand dominate and determine where prices exist at. And is if retailers are willing to utilize supply and demand to determine where prices will be in their grocery stores, you would increase prices on consumers in order to not have mass runs, not have all the product being purchased, where there you would ration out supply with higher prices. So there's technically not a shortage of a product. Obviously, there's demand for that product, but there's not demand for that product at significantly higher prices. You ration the product out by raising prices, and that encourages people to only buy what they need, not more than what they need. So there's not really a beef shortage. There's just a reduction of supply, and that's leading to higher prices. And right now, one of the reasons we're seeing higher prices for consumers is because retailers are bidding up these prices between two grocery stores. If one of them didn't have meat products, then obviously consumers would go to the other grocery store. So there's a bidding war between retailers right now to make sure that their meat cases have meat in them, so consumers shop at their grocery store. So it's not simply on obviously it's definitely not on livestock producers. It's not just on meat packers having the additional leverage right now to have really large margins. But it's also on retailers. Retailers want to have meat in their meat case, and consumers are obviously willing to pay the price right now.
That's a good point, Chris. So we talked a little bit about the effects on the consumer of this so-called bottleneck effect, which another point that we'll mention is that, you know, we're hearing about the bottleneck, but have we truly felt the effects of this bottleneck in full force? Probably not yet. So to the consumer, you know, you might see higher prices at the meat counter in the future. But to the producer, you kind of talked to the number of cattle that are down and being slaughtered right now. So what does this bottleneck mean to all of the producers that are holding back animals that can't, you know, and are continuing to feed out these animals?
Yeah, so the bottleneck, where it's really hurting us, is on the producer side. So on cattle producers, you know, you have 200,000 head this last week. The week before, you had 175,000 head, 150 back to 75,000 head. So, you know, over the last month, you've got close to 500,000 head of cattle that haven't been harvested. That in a normal year would be harvested. So you've got a backlog or a wall of cattle that the only way you can get to those cattle is to get back up to normal harvesting levels and then be above normal harvesting levels. So just in terms of producers, there's still a lot of cattle out there that are going to be higher weights that we're not moving through the system at kind of what we thought. So it's really, really hard to continue to put animals into a system without the right number coming out of the system. So I just think in terms of producers, there's this isn't over as soon as COVID-19 reduces in these plants. Reduces the high levels of spread that may be going through these plants right now. I think another thing for us to think about is that, how it takes a long time to get those numbers back up, especially when they're only able to harvest at about 80% of potential capacity due to concerns of social distancing, things like that. They're not able to use 100% production capacity. So that's the thing that's causing the bottleneck. The bottleneck is not on production side. the bottleneck is on production side because of the lack of harvesting capacity.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So with that framework, let's kind of move into this other hot topic. I saw this quote, and I won't mention where it came from, but it was on social media, and it simply said, why, as the United States, are we importing so much beef when we export so much? So I'd kind of like to go into the conversation of, the basics on our import and export market for the beef industry here, and maybe highlight why global trade is so important to the bottom line of our industry.
Absolutely. So, in terms of the value of the export market on a finished animal is like $300 over $300 a head on a finished animal. And what does that mean back to our feeder calf producers? It's close to probably $100 to $150 a head in terms of the value back to what we do in Florida in terms of producing feeder calves. So export markets are extremely important. What are we exporting? We're exporting extremely high value cuts as well as beef byproducts that we typically would not be utilizing here in terms of the tongues or some of the hides as well as some of the hooves. So byproducts, they're delicacy in some markets. So getting them to those markets around the world is extremely important for us.
Gotcha.
Some of the products, whenever we think about imports and exports, some of the products that are, coming into the United States, they complement what we produce in this system. So, we produce a lot of fat with our fat cattle. We're able to bring in different cuts in terms of lean beef from Australia and sometimes New Zealand. Bringing in those cuts allows us to complement what we are producing here. So it allows us to be very competitive for our consumers and meet the price points that they have in order to compete with poultry and pork.
Very good. And an important point is, in the U.S., we are great consumers of ground beef. And so it's probably the simplest example of why, we're importing certain cattle, leaner cattle, to mix with what we can produce here in order to have that supply that we depend on.
Absolutely.
So with that kind of in mind, this whole thought that, if we're going to rely on this international market, I see this idea out there that there's no way that we can have international trade while still supporting our domestic markets. And so can you kind of talk to how we can meet in the middle there and bridge that gap and, still be able to support our U.S. produced products while still having that international trade that we rely on as an entire industry?
Absolutely. So, if we're consuming meat products in the United States, they're most likely domestically produced products. It's very, very difficult for someone to produce, similar quality product as the United States and then get it delivered here extremely cheaply. My example would be that U.S. is the largest producer of shale oil, and we're not going to be, shipping oil products directly to the Middle East or to Russia, who are very, very high energy producers. So, in terms of just domestically produced products, the majority of the meat you consume is going to be produced here in the United States in general. I think that's one misconception. There may be some meats coming into the United States. It either complements our production or there's some agreement between our government and their government to potentially bring in some product. Maybe they have some oversupply of something, or they just need to get it into our consumers. I think right now it presents the best example of if you potentially have a reduction of beef supply, other countries would be potentially looking at selling it to our consumers rather than their own consumers if there is potential for higher levels of revenue from our consumers versus theirs. again, the things we're talking about in terms of U.S. production right now, in terms of COVID-19, it's not just a U.S. problem. I mean, it's all over the world. So you would see reductions in supply all over the world. Now, this wasn't part of the question, but we'll get into it anyways. Like, you think about the pork industry right now. The pork industry was they were absolutely set up to focus on, hey, there's 40% less pigs in the world today than where we were 3 years ago because of African swine fever. So they were set up to take over some of that production, and in turn, now you have processing capacity. So, they're really, really hurting from that standpoint in terms of getting into these export markets. We take risks. Sometimes they pay off, sometimes they don't.
Very good. So just to kind of wrap up, would you maybe agree that in order to get our U.S. producers the greatest profit, we kind of need to let these markets work and, embrace this global trade that we have going for us? If we stand to get higher prices in Japan for certain cuts, let that happen, but you're still free to choose U.S. products here in the United States. If you want to support local producers, that's a great way to support U.S. beef, but don't necessarily go out of your way to start to diminish some of these kind of free markets that we have established for our overall industry. Because at the end of the day, we're all kind of the difference between the beef industry and then, the live animal side of things. We're all just kind of, as cow-calf producers, we're one step in that supply chain, correct?
Absolutely. We're one sector of the beef industry. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely. I think it's really, really important for us to realize the differences between cattle production and beef production, as well as as I mentioned earlier, these export markets in terms of high value cuts and beef byproducts, that's $300 a head. That if a politician or government got involved and they banned U.S. beef exports of the products that we produce, we banned it. There'd be a significant decline in what we'd be able to receive for our feeder calves. Calf prices would go down. Fat cattle would go down. Yeah. If prices decline, you eventually have a much smaller industry. This is an example of what's happened to the Argentinian beef industry. They put government controls and put additional taxes on exporting beef, and those additional taxes have not allowed their beef industry to grow over the last 15 years. So there's already been times where we've seen this happen across the world, and that's not a very good scenario. I think overall, I think the best example would be is for us as producers and as consumers to focus on our business, be as efficient as we possibly can, because efficiency comes from having imports and exports. Allowing the free market in order to market goods around the world is extremely important for us. Obviously, it costs a significant amount of money to ship something to Japan. So if they're able to pay more for it than we are, as well as pay for the additional cost to get it there, that's extremely important to get that product in the hands of those consumers. As well as on the importing beef side, it requires us to be very efficient as an industry to not let someone come in here and compete with us, and really keeps us cutting edge and really on our toes to be competitive in the beef industry the best that we can. So exports and imports are extremely important for us just in the U.S. beef industry right now.
Very good. Well, I'll kind of, I think we'll leave it there for today, Chris, but thank you so much for joining us and kind of helping to shed some light on some of these topics that are definitely in the mainstream media right now, and kind of what's going on in the face of a global pandemic and our beef industry. So thank you so much for joining us and providing all of your knowledge.
You're welcome. Thank you.